today we're going to do an introduction to Ember, so Ember version 2 specifically. I already met most of you, but my name is David Tang. Alright, so a little bit about me. I actually work at Verizon right now, so Verizon acquired a startup called Edgecast, and it's now called Verizon Digital Media Services, so I'm a UI architect there, and just doing mostly front-end development, where we have a lot of Angular apps, and we're trying to transition them over to Ember actually. So it's kind of a mix between the two. We are actually hiring, I think, so for front-end devs, so if you're interested, you can ask me. I also teach at USC, so there's a department called Information Technology Program. I teach both front-end and back-end web development classes, kind of at the beginner/intermediate level, since a lot of times in schools they don't teach a whole lot of practical web skills. It's usually like hard computer science, so I kind of teach the web side. My last job, I was a senior JavaScript developer at Skechers, doing a lot of Backbone and Marionette and kind of working across that stack and a little bit of Angular, and now I'm kind of on the Ember train. My blog is thejsguy.com, and mostly blogging about kind of JavaScript testing, a lot of Ember lately, have a lot of Angular stuff on there, but it kind of all revolves around testing, architecture, and patterns. That's kind of the stuff I'm really interested in. Alright, so this is what we're going to go over today. We're going to what is Ember? So just kind of what is the framework and how does it compare to others? What are some of the core philosophies of it? How do we install Ember CLI? So Ember comes with a command line utility, and we'll look at that. We'll also just do a getting started. So how do we actually set up an Ember application using Ember CLI? And we'll do a demo. We're going to do a really small demo, so it's not going to touch on everything in Ember, but it's enough so you can start tinkering around and creating a small application that hits GitHub's API. We'll also look at just do an overview of Ember data. So Ember data is another part of Ember. We won't do that in the demo because it's a little bit more complex, but it's like it's kind of like a data modeling library on the client side for working with different backends. I'll also point you to some resources that I think are pretty good for learning Ember, and just some final thoughts. So Ember is an opinionated JavaScript framework, so it probably means so it kind of has a lot of guardrails on it, so it forces developers to do things a certain way. So that comes down to everything from file naming conventions to your project structure. If you find something difficult in Ember, it probably means you're doing it wrong. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to that. If you've worked with other frameworks, you may have seen developers do things multiple ways, and then the code base just looks different and it's very inconsistent. Ember tries to help prevent that by being opinionated, so they kind of tell you how to do certain things. So in the end, it just ensures overall consistency. Ember actually originated from another framework called Sprout Core that was created at Apple. Since then, they've kind of gone off and done their own things, and so now you got Ember, and I don't even know if Sprout Core still exists, but that's where it originated. And even to this day, I think Apple is still using Ember, so they're using it in, I think it's iTunes Music. So the actual, both the web app and I think the actual application that you can download on your computer, that's actually written in Ember. I actually just heard somebody say that PlayStation Now is actually written in Ember, so not even a website, but the thing when you turn on your PlayStation, apparently that's Ember. So it's used, in other places more than just the web. There's 3 parts to Ember. There's Ember itself, the framework. Then there's Ember Data, which is kind of like a data modeling library to interact with different backends. And then there's also Ember CLI, so the command line tool to actually start working with Ember. Ember is typically most often compared to Angular, Backbone, and React. In my opinion, it truly is a framework because it's a very complete package. It has pretty much everything. Whereas with some of the others, you have to find different pieces like a router or data modeling or your build system or testing. You kind of have to piece it all together yourself. Whereas with Ember, it's kind of packaged as a whole, and you just kind of develop in the entire Ember ecosystem. Alright, so here are kind of some of the main philosophies behind it. Like I said, it is a complete solution. So it has everything built into it. So it has ES6 transpiling. So if you ever kind of, you're probably hearing about all this new JavaScript stuff, all the ES6. It actually just comes ready installed with a Babel transpiler, so you can start working with ES6 without actually having to set up Babel. It has a test harness, so if you're into writing tests, and that's everything from unit tests to acceptance tests, it just has it baked in, so you don't have to do any extra setup for that. It has live reload already built in, so you start making changes to files, it automatically reloads in the browser. It provides a router, whereas some of the other React and Angular, I think you have to actually go get a separate router and kind of bring it into the page. This is the router is really central to Ember, and you can't really. It's difficult to kind of write an app without its router. It also has its modeling library, Ember Data, and it has a build system. So how many of you have actually tried writing a task like a gulp or a grunt task to do everything from minification, concatenation, all that stuff? It already has it, and it's one command away, Ember build, and so it kind of takes care of all that. Another kind of core philosophy behind Ember is that it adheres to convention over configuration. So a lot of the small choices are made for you, and that comes down to everything from file naming to project directory structure to just all those little choices. So pretty much every Ember app that you see, so if you're working on one and you try and work on another, they all tend to look the same because all of the conventions are kind of baked into the framework, and it's a little bit hard to deviate from them. It's also really beneficial following convention over configuration. So as opposed to every developer working with different JavaScript libraries and configuring every little piece so that it works together, Ember configures it for you and then follows a set of conventions so that it makes it really good for developers or for large teams. So you want to make it so that every developer's code looks the same between one person running and the next person. If you have a really large team and there's too many ways you can do things, the code can kind of become very inconsistent and just overall hard to maintain. But because there's a lot of conventions in place and it's hard to deviate from, for large teams it's really great, and it makes it so that everyone's very consistent. It's also really good for onboarding. So have you ever been in the situation where you're working on maybe one JavaScript framework and it's really hard to onboard someone because you've created your own set of conventions, whether it's file naming, folder structure, how you do things in the actual file. There's multiple ways to do things. Like, I guess, if you're talking about Angular, you can do things using scope or controller as. There's a few ways of doing that. There's always that developer ramp-up time that you might have because there's many ways you can do things. Whereas with Ember, you're following kind of the one way of doing things, so it makes it really, if you know Ember, you kind of know the conventions baked into it, so you can be a lot more productive much more quickly. They also kind of adhere to something called stability without stagnation. So what that means is they ensure that the framework is stable without stagnating innovation. And so, a good example of this is as they start progressing between Ember 1 and Ember 2, they don't actually deprecate a bunch of stuff and leave all the developers hanging without providing a good upgrade path. They provide things like deprecation warnings. So if you start using something that's a little bit old, they're going to tell you in the console, and you're going to start seeing deprecation warnings like, hey, don't use this feature, use this other path. And so that's kind of how they keep the framework stable without stagnating the innovation.
The warnings come out in Angular 1 while Angular 2.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of like, they made a big bang rewrite, and so it's very different. So the upgrade is going to be a little bit tougher, whereas if you're at the last version of Ember, which is like 1.13, it's pretty much the same as Ember 2, just with all the deprecations removed. So if you, in theory, if you're working on Ember 1 and you fixed, and you're on the latest version of 1, you fixed all the deprecation warnings, it'll just work in version 2. So the upgrades tend to be a lot simpler, and they don't really leave anyone behind because I think every member on the core team actually has an Ember app in production, and they don't want to rewrite this thing in a whole other framework just to rewrite their app. Like, they actually have their stakeholders in their products, and they want to change that, so they don't want to rewrite it, and so they make it upgrades possible. They also adhere to web standards and the future of JS. So like I said, they have ES6 already built into it. They follow web components, so they're trying to adhere to the spec things like native promises in the browser. That's actually their version of promises. They have their own library built on promises. They kind of adhere to the native version so that in theory, I think in the future, then they can kind of just go with what's the future as of the web. And then they also really have a lot of great testing tools built in. So if you've ever had to set up a testing framework with other JavaScript stacks, it can take a little bit of time. Like I know I spent like a couple days trying to configure Karma with Jasmine, with Sign-On, with some, all these different tools, and it works, but usually there's holes in it, and it can be a little frustrating because then you don't figure out what those pitfalls are maybe a few weeks down the line. Ember's is really nice. It just works out of the box. You don't really have to do any configuration. It's there. So there's no reason not to write tests. All right, so to install Ember, there's a few ways you can do it. You just want to make sure that you install it without sudo. So that's kind of one thing that you don't really see very often. And so I ran into that mistake. I tried installing it and doing sudo npm install Ember CLI. It just causes problems. So don't do that. So if you want to get around it, I wrote in that little green box, you can just change where global modules are installed, and you can put it to a particular area on your machine that doesn't require sudo. So a common path, you can put it inside your home directory and inside a folder called npm. Alternatively, if you're using Node Version Manager, then you don't have to worry about it. And if you don't want to run it on your machine, or if you have Windows and you're not sure how to set it up, you can also try on Cloud9. I made a video tutorial on just how to do it. It's like 2 minutes long. So if you want to just play around and get familiar with it, that's a good way to do it. Ember is actually built on top of a browser compilation library, called Broccoli. So there's Grunt, Gulp, and there's also Broccoli. It's built on top of Broccoli. I don't really know a whole lot about it, except for it's just apparently really fast, but just kind of worth noting. Also, I forgot to mention, Ember actually it has a few dependencies. So it does use, so it depends on jQuery. So that's kind of, you don't have to incorporate that. And it also depends on something called handlebars. All right, so if you were to create your first Ember app, this is really all you have to do once you get Ember CLI installed. You just say Ember new, and then specify your project name. You can cd into that folder, and then run Ember server. And then it just boots up a local server, serves all the files, does all the transpiling, sets up all your tests. That's really it. It comes with a lot of different commands, which we'll kind of start doing in a demo. But if you want to type in like ember-help, it'll kind of list out all the different commands. And it'll feel like if you've worked with Rails or any other maybe PHP frameworks, a lot of the backend frameworks have command line tools for scaffolding out a project. That's what Ember CLI is. All right, so we're going to do a quick demo. So I've already created my project. So in theory, if you were to create a new app, you would run Ember new. In my case, I did JavaScript LA-Ember, and that would create a new app. But I've already done that, and I've cd'd into that project directory, so I already have it, but that's the command. And again, once you have Ember installed, you can run --help, and you can see all these different commands, which it doesn't look very good because I've zoomed in, but you can see all these different options.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Quick question. What OS are you on?
I'm on Mac. Which version?
Yeah. Are you on
10.10. Oh, Yosemite. I think it works on most of them. I don't know if I have the latest. Is there one after this?
I have the latest, and I've been having some problems with it. That's why I'm asking.
Oh, really? Okay. If not, I can help you afterwards.
Yeah.
Do you guys like the lights down? Yeah. Is that good? The other one. Sorry. Very good.
Okay, so here's my project, and if you want to start it up, you can run the command ember server or ember serve or just ember s. So you might see any variations of it, but that basically starts up a local web server that's, I think, built on top of Express. Just give it a minute. And then we can copy out localhost 4200. put it in the browser. I'm actually going to get rid of that. And then you'll get a nice little message that says welcome to Ember. And then in the actual debug console, it'll say you're in development mode when you start this up, so it'll tell you which versions of Ember, Ember Data, and jQuery that you're running. All right, so typically when you're working with Ember, I have two commands. I leave this one going, and then I have another window just so I can run all my Ember generate commands. Let me open this a little bit. All right, so we're gonna just build a simple, like two-page, single-page application that hits GitHub's API. It's an open API, so you can actually make cross-domain AJAX requests to it, and without any problems. There is a rate limit on it, so I'm hoping I don't hit it, but it's pretty good for working with demos. So it's just gonna be a small little two-pager. I wonder if I need to zoom in a little. All right, so when you install an Ember app, there's a few different folders it gives you. Can you guys see this, or is it kind of small?
Maybe you can talk through it.
Talk through. Okay, so at the root level, you have a folder called app, and this is where most of your Ember code is going to be. And then you also have a folder called tests, so all your tests. You have a folder called config, so you can specify different environments like development and production. It does depend on Node and Bower, so you're going to have different packages for Bower components and Node modules. And then you have a public directory, which contains some of your public assets. And then you have a folder called dist. So this dist folder, when you actually want to build an Ember application, they compile everything together from your ES6 to your templates, concatenate everything, minify it, do the what's called fingerprinting, so the specific versions so things don't get cached too long. And that all gets put inside your dist folder. So in theory, once you build your Ember application, you can take that dist folder, plop it on a CDN, and you can run your Ember application from there. So that's kind of the overall structure of it. So let's go ahead and look inside this app folder. So I'm serving up, if you go to the browser, and I'm at the root of the page. So I'm at a route called /. So I'm seeing this sign, welcome to Ember. Now, the thing that's being served up is this file called index.html. So again, this is inside the app folder. And behind the scenes, you're probably not going to have to touch this file. I rarely do, but this Ember kind of takes this file and uses it as its boilerplate index file, and you'll see things like vendor.js, which they concatenate all your third-party JavaScript vendor into that one single file. You have your application-specific code inside JavaScript LA-Ember.js, and you have the same thing for CSS, and they basically inject all your content in this content for body. Now this is just a template. I rarely ever have to touch this. Most of the code is in all these other folders. Okay, so we see welcome to Ember on the actual page, but where does that actually exist in the file system? So this actually exists in a folder called templates. And inside the templates, there's something called the application template. So this application template right here, where you see welcome to Ember, it has our H1, and this whole thing is basically getting injected to right here, content for body. So Ember is doing this for us behind the scenes. So it truly is a single page app. And you're going to see this outlet. So this is kind of our main web page. But then as we start navigating between different URLs in our single page app, all of that content is going to get output into this outlet tag. And this is a handlebars expression. So handlebars is the templating library for Ember. And that's where all our content's going to get injected. So as we start creating pages, we're going to see it basically getting swapped right there. All right, so let's go ahead and create our first route.
Can I ask, how does you know, on the index HTML content for body, why does that go into application outlet? Like,
Same exact question here.
Oh yeah, so all of this right here will get basically injected right here, and that happens because of Ember CLI build process. So they turn your body as the root element of your entire application. So unlike a lot of other JavaScript libraries where you can kind of piece things together on the page, and you don't like the entire page doesn't have to be maybe Angular or React. With Ember, it's kind of like the whole page is, because you're treating it as a truly single page app.
But how does it know to put it for body and not?
That happens inside Ember CLI build process.
So outlet is directly linked.
Oh no. So right here, this whole all this HTML, including the outlet, this basically gets replaced, or that replaces this piece. So if we were to view the page source, well, okay, I guess it's all it's in the DOM, but think of like copying all of this right here.
yeah, it's just that, so content for head, I assume there's a convention for where that goes.
Yeah.
A certain file for that.
Yeah, there's it's these other content for blocks. I wouldn't get hung up on this too much because you rarely ever have to touch it, but this is more of a way for Ember plugin, they call them Ember add-ons, but Ember add-on authors to get things injected into your page without you having to manually put things in. So you can have these add-ons that inject things into these blocks. But the content for body, that's just kind of handled by Ember CLI, and they take whatever is inside application HBS, so it stands for handlebars, and injects that into there. And that just happens through the build process. But yeah, you rarely ever, I hardly ever have to touch this file, but it's good knowing just in the end, it gets built from this.
So what would go under body footer?
Oh, like these? Yeah, so these are mostly for like hooks for Ember plugin or Ember add-on authors. Like if you wanted to do Google Analytics, you don't want to have people copy and paste that into here. They can actually write something like an add-on that says injected into body footer during their build process, and then they can look at they can basically know that they can place it in it's like a little placeholder for authors to put things in. Yeah, don't get hung up on it too much. There's actually really nothing in there, I think, by default. It's mostly as like a placeholder to say, like for other authors, like when you're working in an Ember app, you can install all these different add-ons, and if you want things injected in there, authors can say, okay, I want my add-on to be injected in that place, and Ember CLI will take care of that for you, assuming the author said, place my stuff in something called body footer, and this is already default kind of with Ember. So yeah, it's mostly like, if you want to throw things at the bottom of the page, maybe like a Google Analytics script or.
I guess the unclarity is how do you relate it by tags? So
This happens in Ember CLI.
So application gets placed within body.
Yep. But then I think by default there's nothing that gets injected here. But you can if you wanted to write like an Ember add-on. But yeah, it's that happens inside the Ember CLI build process.
So right now we have a welcome page, and let's say I have a to-do page and a message page. It will still go into body, and it will all appear like.
Yeah. So okay.
Switch between the views.
So sort of. So the way Ember works is, okay, so your application template gets injected into the content for body. Now, as you start defining different routes, outlet is basically the main placeholder where all your content gets swapped out. So this will be things. How many of you actually have worked with Angular? Okay, so if you worked with Angular, you know how you have that thing called ngView for your router? Treat outlet like ngView. So ngView is that main area, that div where you can say, okay, I want for every route, put the content inside that placeholder. That's what outlet is in the Ember world. So as we start creating routes, you're going to see things getting, well, you can see that eventually things will get injected into that outlet. Any other questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and create our first route. So Ember, one of the core principles of Ember is that they like to, they really focus on having URLs that work. So they have a router, and it's really central to the framework. You pretty much have to use the router in almost every Ember app, whereas with maybe some other libraries that you can kind of think of it as an afterthought. So let's go ahead and create our first route. So we're going to follow something. We're going to have a URL structure where it's going to be localhost / and then a username. So in this case, we'll have a username, like a GitHub username, and we can pull that from the URL and make different requests to GitHub's API and do something with it. So if you want to go ahead and create a route, you can use the ember generate command. So again, either ember g or ember generate. And I want to generate a route. And the route I want to generate, in this case, it's going to be called a user route. Now I've actually already generated these files because I didn't want to type out HTML in front of you. So I'm going to just say I don't want to overwrite the ones I've made by default. But it will create these files. And whenever you generate a route, you get two files. You get routes and templates. So every route has a corresponding template. And that basically means when you hit the route, the address, or the URL, it's going to render that corresponding template. So let's go ahead and look at these files. Now you can see that just from the CLI, they put it in a particular place. They put it in a templates folder. And they put a route inside the routes folder. So you might be able to change it, but it might be hard. I've never actually tried. But you can see this is where their conventions are being forced upon you, like directory structure, file naming conventions, all that. All right, so the two files that were created were under routes, there's this user.js, and then under templates, there was a user.hbs. So a route is basically a class that gets instantiated when a particular URL is hit. Now, that URL is defined inside of a file called router.js, and this is sitting inside that app folder. And the router.js file is basically a map of all the different URLs in your entire Ember application. So it's nice because if you want to get a good overview of your Ember app, you can just look at your router file, and this will tell you all the different URLs in your system without cluttering it up with things like AJAX calls or data parsing or any of that. It just simply says what are the URLs and what's the hierarchy of those URLs. So this is our router. So there's two pieces inside Ember. There's the router and then routes. And so I know a lot of people get confused on that. The router is basically the thing that says here are all the URLs in my system, and when you hit one of those URLs, it instantiates a particular route object. So it's kind of like this class or constructor function kind of thing that basically gets created when that URL is hit. So in this case, when you actually create, when I did that Ember generate, it actually generated this. Now ignore this, all this repo stuff actually. Okay, so it actually generated this .route user, and then I added this extra path configuration to say I want this to be a dynamic segment. So when I hit the URL, I want it to be localhost / ember.js or localhost / skaterdave85. So that's what this dynamic segment is. So here's one of our URLs, and this URL has one dynamic segment for the username, and it's called the user route. So one particular user. All right, so when this route is hit, so when anything, basically this is our URL path. When this hits, it's going to match to a corresponding route object. In this case, ember.route. And when that hits, you can specify what's called a model hook. And the model hook is where you do your data fetching. So in here, I'm just using simple jQuery, but I'm making an AJAX call to api.github.com. I just want to get, I'm passing in my username, and I'm just using plain jQuery, $.get.json tags to make the call. Now, ember.dollar and just dollar, they're the same thing. It's just sometimes you could actually have just done this too. But if you want to kind of see for other reasons, you can just do ember.dollar. There's no real reason. Okay, so here's my Ajax call. So let's actually go to the browser and do this. So I'm going to go to /SkaterDave85. So this is my GitHub. So you're not going to really see anything because I actually have the template commented out. But let's see, you can see that it did make an Ajax call. So when you hit / the dynamic segment SkaterDave85, which is the URL inside our router file, or inside the router, it triggered the user route, and the user route is inside routes, and then user.js, so right here. And the first thing that happens is this model hook. And then params correspond to URL parameters. So it's like an object that contains all the URL parameters. And I'm just picking off that username right here. So the highlighted piece, syntax highlighting I think got a little messed up, but params.username corresponds to this username. And then we make the Ajax call, and then we just return the promise from the model hook. So in the model hook, this is where your data fetching happens. It's kind of the one place where you do data fetching. All right, so after this happens, once the model hook gets invoked, it then goes ahead and renders the template. So in my template, I've commented everything, but I'm going to uncomment it and save. And if you look at this, it's pretty much just a bunch of HTML. I kind of stripped out some of the stuff that was on GitHub. So that's what all these vCard things are. I actually have no idea. I kind of stole the styling from GitHub just to make it look decent. But you're going to see all these different little expressions. And these are placeholders. So if you've worked with Angular, it's the same syntax, double curlies, and these are placeholders. And you can access model.name, model.login. And these all correspond to the data from that Ajax call.
What happens if you have multiple models?
Yeah, so there's different ways of handling that. That's when you get into things like, typically, if you have multiple models, that's when you get into Ember Data. And Ember Data basically allows you to create kind of like a client-side ORM. If you work with ORMs on the back end, it's more of like a library for managing like a relational database in your browser. So typically, if you have one model, it's related to other models. And in Ember Data, you can say, okay, I have a post model, but it has many comments, and each comment is its own model. And so we'll look at Ember Data in a little bit, but that's where relationships come in, and that's when you really start to see the power of Ember Data, because you can model your data with these different classes and specify relationships between the different models, whereas with some of the other, like I know in Angular, it doesn't really have anything built in for that. You have to go kind of roll your own. So that's when you want multiple models.
Could you go back to router.js for a second?
Yep.
So you specify the route in the map and then have a separate JavaScript file for it?
Yeah, so behind the scenes, Ember CLI sees, okay, when you ran that Ember generate command, it generated, I'll actually just type it out. So this is what it originally put when I said Ember generate. But then I tweaked it a little bit because I didn't want the path to be /user. I want it to be a dynamic segment. So then there's an extra option. You can say path and then specify like a URL segment. And then, so then you could have done path username. Probably should have commented this file out a little bit.
If you wanted it more traditionally like /users /username.
Yeah, if you wanted to, you could do, yeah, exactly. You could do /user/username.
And if you didn't pass in that, option, that
this path,
the objects at all, what happens with just this?
then it would have just been /user, like the actual word user.
And just the one
Yeah,
route. It doesn't create a whole bunch of
exactly, yeah. So in this case, it's a dynamic segment. And then this third argument, the function, we haven't gotten into it yet, but when you say you want nested routes, so if you want something like /ember.js/repos, that's when you can have nested routes. So it's very clear. You can see the hierarchy between all your routes through this one single file. Okay, so I've just taken some of the data, plopped it onto the page with a little bit of styling, but not a whole lot here. So you can just see these data binding, or these expressions, and these are just handlebar expressions, so it'll feel pretty familiar. There is one if statement. So you can say if there is an email, it'll render this block, otherwise it won't. So it's kind of like the equivalent of ng if you're coming from the Angular world. All right, so I left this piece open so we can just do this right now. So I want to output the date. So there's actually a property called model.createdAt. So from this API request, and you can see that the live reload's working, so you don't really have to set any of that up yourself. And so it outputs it out, and it's like a timestamp, so it's not really the prettiest thing. So let's actually turn this into something pretty. So how would you go about doing this in Ember? So if you're coming from the Angular world, you create something like a filter, which then basically runs this thing through a function, then outputs it. Ember has kind of the equivalent, and it's called a helper. So if you use a helper to transform one value into another. So I'm going to create a helper called formatDate. So we're going to say Ember generate helper called formatDate. And I've created these a little bit ahead of time, so I'm just not going to overwrite what I originally had. But look what it generated. It generated both a helper inside the helpers folder, and it also generated a corresponding unit test. So you don't have to do any of that setup yourself. Like everything's just made, just ready to go. So you can actually start writing a test if you wanted to. And we will towards the end. Okay, so this helper is called formatDate. So I can call this helper from my template by just saying formatDate and then specifying the value right after it. So right now this formatDate helper is empty. We haven't done anything, but we'll go ahead and fill that in. All right, so if you go inside the app folder, helpers, here's formatDate, and we can go ahead and just fill this in. This is just going to take the parameters, and you can say, what did I do before? We'll say the date is equal to a new instance of our date constructor, and inside params is an array. So as we pass in values outside of our template, so right here, you can pass in multiple arguments to a helper, and this basically turns into an array. In this case, I only have one option, so I'm just going to pick off the first item. I'm going to turn it into a date, and I'm going to return date that it's toDateString. So there's kind of a built-in method on the date class that formats it a little bit. You can get crazier here if you wanted to. But now, okay, so now it's no longer a timestamp. So that's kind of the equivalent of a filter in Angular, but how you do it in Ember. Okay, so then the next thing, let me actually just zoom in a little. All right, so I have this view repositories text. So I want to turn this into an actual link so that when I click on it, it's going to list a bunch of repositories on the right-hand side, and it's also going to change the URL. So one of the big things about Ember is that when you start modifying the page, you probably want to update the URL so that if a user copies the URL and sends it off to another person, they get the same exact state. The state is really managing the URL, and they don't get with an experience where they see one thing and you see something else. So they're really big on making sure that the URL preserves state. So that's why you kind of generate routes for everything. And so everything gets persisted in the URL. All right, so I'm going to close this. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to generate another route. I'll do clear. And we can say Ember generate route. And in this case, it is a route called repos underneath the user's route. So we're going to say user/repos, and this will create basically a nested route. So when you actually do that, I'm not going to override the files that I already created. But again, it created another route class, and it created a route template. And it actually generates also a unit test too. So pretty much whenever you run these generate commands, it creates tests for everything. So if you can fill them in if you want, you don't have to. Obviously, it's probably recommended to write tests, but it makes it a lot easier to get into testing just because it generates it automatically. All right, so when we ran that command, back inside the router, this is what it generates. So it parses this and then it makes it nested by specifying a function for the user route, and then you can say this.route repos. So now my URL becomes kind of the aggregate between the paths of the upper routes and then itself. So if you go to our browser, it would be the username /repos. Now I don't have anything in the template yet, but that's where that comes from. So you can see that the URL hierarchy, it corresponds to also the hierarchy inside this router file. Now just so you can see it, if we wanted to generate, well, we'll just generate another route. You can say ember generate route, we'll call it user/settings. You can see it just generated another route under settings. Maybe I want to put something under settings called profile. Yeah, that's a good one. Ember generate route user/settings/profile. And so you can see kind of the nestedness of it. Now you can, for each of these nested routes, if you want to modify the path, that's what this second option becomes. So let's go ahead and just open up that profile and let's throw in some static text in there. So if we look at our templates, this URL hierarchy is preserved inside the templates directory too. So you can see user/settings/profile. And by default, all of them have these outlets, which basically allow you to keep nesting content within routes. So I can say my profile. So if you go to our URL, repos, or let's see, I think it was settings/profile. You can see my profile. And so all of these things get nested within each other. Now if we wanted to go back and go to the settings, so if we look at this, let's kind of traverse down just so you can see how this whole hierarchy and template stuff works. This is a little confusing at first, but if you do, okay, so the first thing that gets hit is this user. Inside the user template, I have an outlet. So the outlet is the placeholder for content for nested routes. So the nested route for the user would be the settings template. So anything inside the settings, we'll say settings, this will get injected into its parent route, which is, so it gets injected right here. So you can see settings and then my profile. So then settings also has its own outlet. So any of its child routes, any of that content gets injected into its outlet. So the profile, because it's a nested route of settings, that gets injected into here.
What happens if you get rid of that outlet?
If you get rid of it, then you won't see the thing getting injected. So you'll hit the route, but you won't see the you won't see the nested content from that route getting placed in there. But that's how you create kind of like so they believe in or Ember believes in nested URLs correspond to nested UI hierarchies. A pretty common example is like a list details view where you have maybe a list of items on the left-hand side, and when you click each one of those items, you want more details about a to-do or something. So on the right-hand side, you see the actual details of that to-do, and that's like a good example of maybe you have a list like /to-dos, and then you also have like /to-do/1 for a specific one, and so you have a nested UI hierarchy along with that matches your URL. So it's a little weird at first, but that's that's kind of like, I guess they found a pretty common pattern in a lot of web apps is that nested URLs correspond oftentimes to nested UI hierarchies, and so they kind of built that into the framework. You can change that, but a lot of times, I guess it depends on the app. So you can change it, but that's the default. Yeah.
I don't know if anyone else is confused on this, but what's the purpose of user.js under the routes?
Oh, yes, right here. So every URL has a class that gets created when it gets hit, and it runs a series of methods. One of them is called the model hook, and that basically does your data fetching. So like before it renders anything, it fetches the data, collects all that data, and then passes it along to the template for it to be rendered. So
is this a model now?
So the route is just another object that deals with, think of like it's an object that corresponds to the URL. So you hit this URL, and there's an object associated with it, and that object is doing data fetching.
Is it
Like a
like a
controller.
controller?
So you can think it so like in Angular, it's right. You have the router, which is the URLs, and then when you hit a URL, it kind of loads a controller, right? It's kind of like that. Now Ember also has the concept of a controller, but the controller it's used a little bit differently. Whereas Ember's controller is more about decorating your model with display logic properties. So things like things that don't need to be on the model. So they make a separation between your models, which are like records in your database, but there's other properties in your UI like is shown or is hidden, is active, like that kind of stuff. That's stuff that kind of goes on your controller where it decorates your model with view-specific stuff. So that's where things kind of controllers deviate a little bit. But you can think of the route inside Ember as kind of like the controller in Angular. So yeah, so this route object, it fetches a bunch of data, passes it along to the template, and then you can render it.
So what do you call this? Do you call this a route file?
Yeah, you call it a route. So I'm hitting the user route. So you look
It's
at
not a model. It's not a controller.
it's a route. Yeah, it's like a user route. That's what they call it. So it's like a route, as in like this object. Yeah, it's like a noun. So it's a user route. You can, if you were to say like in Angular, like, oh, this controller loads when you hit this URL. It's kind of like, in Ember, it's more like this route for this URL.
Do you have to have it in a separate file, or you could have it?
Yes. So when you start generating things on the command line, this is where Ember's convention over configuration kicks in, where it's like they tell you what these files are named, where it's located, so that every Ember project follow these same conventions, and it makes it easy for developers to hop between these projects and know where things are. Because a lot of times what happens is, like, I know in the Angular world, like, I've created it one way, someone created it another way, and it's very difficult to figure out the different conventions. So now it's like they've created the conventions and you just follow them.
I mean, the contents of the user.js file couldn't be incorporated in the router.js?
No. Yeah, so they make the separation. So your router is the thing that maps all the URLs in the hierarchy. The routes are the things that actually have logic for data fetching or redirecting to other URLs or that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a confusing part because you got router and route, and they sound very similar. But router is for the URL mappings and hierarchy, and route is the actual object for the particular URL you hit. Any others? Okay, so when we hit the user route, we do this, and we rendered it, and it rendered again. So you'll notice that all these file names, like the route is also called user.js, and then the template's called user.hbs. So they're all kind of user. For the user route, everything's called user. So even if you had, we're not going to create a controller, but if we had a controller, it would be also called user.js. And they're just separated out by different folders. So we got routes, models, controllers, they're just in different folders, but they're all called user.js. So it makes things consistent and easy to find.
And just a question.
Yeah.
What is app.js doing? Usually we have all the routing in.
Oh, this thing? This is basically, it's one of those files you rarely have to touch, but it creates an instance of an Ember application. So things you can things you might want to control, like I can't think of any off the top of my head, but there's different configurations you might want to pass. Okay, here's a good one. So if you want to say like by default, the Ember application uses the body tag as the placeholder to start injecting dynamic content, but maybe you want like it to be an actual element called main content or something. You know, that'd be something you could pass in to configure it. But it's one of those files like setup. Probably don't have to touch it for for a lot of simple apps. All right, so inside the router, we created that nested route called repos. Let's go ahead and link to it from here. So when I say view repos, I want to link to it. So the way we do this in Ember is we use what's called a link to helper, and then we specify the route. So in this case, it's user.repos. So you can treat it like an anchor tag, and behind the scenes, this actually does create an anchor tag. And if I save it, it'll automatically refresh. Now it turns into a link, and you can see that the actual URL is /repos. So if you were to click it, the URL changes. And let's go ahead and just update the template. So we'll say repos template. You can see repos template just being injected in the corresponding outlet for the user template, for its parent template. One of the great things about this is if you try and target a route that doesn't exist, like if I misspell it and I refresh, it's just going to break completely. It's going to tell you inside the console there is no named route. So it's really easy to. It makes it so that you don't have to type in. If you misspell a link and it like breaks, it's like it'll tell you your app won't work at all.
Okay, question about strings. When do you write it as a string, and when do you?
Yeah. So if you wanted like a variable, that's when it wouldn't be like the if statement. This is more of like a variable. So it's like an expression. It'll interpret that as a JavaScript variable, but this is an actual string. This user.repos isn't a variable. It's just like we're just telling the link to helper that we want to hit the string user repos. Yeah, I guess it's pretty much the same as like in Angular. Sometimes you use quotes and sometimes you don't. So it depends. Oh, okay. It's more of like if you have like it's whether it's a variable or not. In this case, model is a variable that came from the route, but this one isn't.
What would be a good resource to get sense of what is and what isn't?
Usually, if you just look at the documentation for the helpers for the different syntax as part of handlebars, you start to get pretty familiar with like the if helper and the link to, and then you start to remember as you start typing it. But it's working with it a little bit.
This user.repos, when you clicked it, it obviously saved the same user that you were already in.
Yeah.
What if you wanted to link it to a different user?
Yeah, if I wanted to say, okay, let's turn it into ember.js, you can pass it as the parameter, and this will fill in that dynamic segment username in the URL. So now if we go back, you can see it's ember.js.
Wait, what happened there?
So I actually changed the link. So instead of it being skaterdave85/repos, now I wanted to say, I wanted to specify like that dynamic segment username inside the router. So this piece right here, I want to say, okay, what's the value for this? So I manually specified the string ember.js. Now, I could have also done model. I think it's like username, or it might have been model.login. This would have filled in kind of the dynamic segment, so that's how you get the user. Otherwise, it'll just default to the current URL. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish the repos. Okay, so we have our URL, so now let's go back to, now we go to the repos route. So this URL will trigger a route called repos. And if you look at the folder structure, hits user/repos. Now this one is just like the other model hook, where I do another call to GitHub's API, and it's just a different URL, but I'm passing in the. So if you actually looked at GitHub's API initially, let me actually pull it up. So the first call to actually get this left sidebar stuff, like my picture and my name and stuff, that actually, this was this API call. And inside this call, they actually have another property called repos URL, which is a link to another endpoint that returns a list, an array of all the repos for my username. So I want to get access to this this property and then make a call to that thing so that I can get all my repos to list on my page. So if we look at this route, this is pretty similar to the user route, and I'll open up that one too so you can see them side next to each other. So again, ignore the token stuff, that's just to prevent the rate limiting with GitHub. And I do an AJAX call. You can just do $.get.json with jQuery. And so how do I get this property repos URL? So the cool thing about nested routes in Ember is that because they're nested, I can actually get the model from the repos route, or I can get the model from the user route from the repos route. So if I'm on the repos route, I can say, okay, because I'm nested under user, let me go get the model from any previous routes, parent routes, and I can access it. So inside of my repos route, there's a method called model for. I want to get the model for the user route, and then I want to access the property repos URL, and then just make an API call to it. So the cool thing when you have nested routes, you have also nested. You can actually get the model from previous parent routes. So I make this call, and then it renders the repos template. So if you go to our templates, we can see the repos template. And I'm just going to uncomment this and delete this. And here you can see another handlebars expression where we just kind of loop over the model, which is all the list of repositories for this route, and just output some information about it. So it's kind of like your ng repeat inside Angular, just another syntax. We go back. You can see just a list of repositories. And so if you look at this, let's start off with the bare application. If we go to / just my username, you can see nothing on the right hand side. We just get the model from the user route rendered. We click on view repositories, and it renders it inside its outlet. So we have like a nested UI hierarchy. So also another great feature of Ember is that they have something called loading states. So when a particular route is loading, so when that model hook fires and it basically returns a promise. And if that promise hasn't resolved, then it'll render a specific template called loading in those outlets. And so if you've ever in Angular, you've ever done something like scope.loading is true, and then later when the promise resolved, you say scope.loading equals false. That's kind of taken care of, for you in Ember just by declaring a template called loading, and Ember will see, okay, is this particular route loading or not based on the model hook, and it'll render it for you. So let's go ahead and generate that. So from our command line, we can say ember generate. So you can say ember g or ember generate template, and we can just call it loading. So I've already created this, so I'm just going to say no, but it just creates a template inside the loading. Now here's the template, and I just googled for like fancy CSS animations, and I found something. I don't know exactly all about this, but It's just a little bit of HTML, and then inside my CSS file, I copied some cool like transition stuff. I'm not a CSS expert, so but we have this loading template that contains the animation, and because I've
Where does the CSS go for that?
oh yeah, good question. So there's a folder inside the app folder called styles, so app.css. So I've really just copied a bunch of CSS from different places just to make it kind of pretty, but it's like terrible CSS. Okay, so because I put this template, so loading HBS, and it's right next to our user route, or the template, the user template, which corresponds to the user route, this will get injected into the outlet when the model hook is pending. So hopefully you guys can see this. Let's see. We'll browse to.
What you're saying because it's in the same direction.
There we go. Yeah, just because it's existing in the same in the templates directory as a sibling to the template for the user template. So you
but you'd probably have a bunch of in there, right?
So yeah, if we look at router.js, so this user route has a template called user HBS, right? No, you have to ignore that piece. I didn't have to generate a route, but as long as I have a template that sits next to the template right next. So when I say sits next to it, it has to be just on the same like hierarchy. It doesn't have to actually be physically next to it, but it's if it's in the same directory as where this template lives, it'll render that in its outlet.
Are you talking about parent-child type relationship?
Yes. So if I can, let's see. It's kind of hard to see a little bit, but if you look at this templates folder, see how there's, let's see, where is it? User HBS, and then right next to it is loading HBS. When this user is pending, it's going to render this thing for you.
But I mean, you could also have other templates in there. You could have like post.hbs and it'll use that same loading.
Yes, it'll use that same loading. So if you want to change that, I think there's a configuration where you can say like if you want different ones. But a lot of times in most sites, like you have the same loader, and so you want it consistent. But there might be a way to change that.
So there's only one loading, multiple.
There's one loading at this level for the user. So if you have like another route, right, another template called let's see, post, yeah, for post. While post is loading, it's going to use this template to inject it into the right into the outlet. Which in this case, the outlet would have been the parent, which is the application template. So if you actually looked at it, we were rendering it, you can see it rendering. So that's the cool thing. You don't have to have any scope, loading, false, true, change it. It's like it just handles it by the framework based on the model, on the state of that model hook.
I'm sorry, what am I looking differently? I missed something.
Oh, yeah, do you see it? The little spinner?
Oh.
Right there.
Oh, got it.
It's pretty fast, but yeah. So we can actually make, okay, so when we hit view repositories, we probably also want a little spinner. So right now you don't get a spinner, so let's go ahead and create the same spinner. So we're going to generate Ember generate template, and this one's going to be in user/loading. So it's going to sit right next to the repos. So I'm going to say no because I already have it. And we go inside templates user. I have the same exact thing, I just copied it again. Save it. And let me actually just... Okay, so now when I click this, you can watch for the little spinner on the right. It's pretty fast, but yeah. So now you can just simply declare a loading template, and it'll just figure it out based on the state of the route. You don't have to have any like variables to set this. Okay, so this is kind of a simple app, but you got like an idea of this. I guess here's another cool thing. Well, before we get into the testing part.
I'm not sure you're going to cover it, but what's like the equivalent of a service for Angular?
Oh, and Ember? They also have the concept of services. So if you wanted to create services, it's Ember generate service. You can call it, I don't know, shopping cart.
So it's just a singleton.
Yeah, it's a singleton, just like Angular.
Factories.
Yeah, same thing. All right, so one really cool thing is, okay, so in here I set my path to just the username, but if I want to change this to say, I don't know, users/username, I can simply update that in the path, and I don't have to change anything else in my application because anywhere I've declared a link, like user.hbs, in this case I've only declared it once, but because we're using these link to helpers, we're linking to the route name. We're not specifying URL so that we can easily change our URL structure if we want to. So in this case, I can save it, and then we can change our URL to users/, and it just works. So it makes for really seamless URL updates.
How would you be able to overwrite that area to the right of the picture?
Oh, right here?
Yeah.
So this is, so remember, this is the repos route, right? The repos route. And so the repos route has a repos template. And then the repos template, you can see it's like a little loop that loops over some HTML and the list of repositories and just outputs it to the page. This is where you'd update it. So you could say like h3 my repos.
So say if there was another link on the page and you wanted to use that space to display other content,
Mhm.
how would you
You'd-
toggle it?
Yeah, you'd have to create another outlet in here. So we could say outlet. And then inside here, we'd have to have a nested route under repos. So let's say, okay, so here's repos. Let's go ahead and create another one. So we need to create a nested route. So we're going to create ember generate route user/repos/comments. So you can see our router.js file got updated. It made a nested route under here. We can go ahead and update the corresponding template. So my comments. Let's see, is it on here somewhere? Oh, yes, thanks. Forgot. Yeah, so there it is, my comments.
Well, I mean, how would you be able to overwrite it? Like,
Oh, the nestedness? Oh, if you don't want the nested?
not nested, but the entire content. How would you be able to use that space to for something else to display something?
Just replace
else
that whole.
entirely?
Oh, this whole list?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, so then if you looked at our router, so we had so we had repos, that was one route.
Right.
A sibling route is settings. So we would, instead of having repos, it would be /settings. And then see now it's just another route. So it's like a sibling. So that the outlet from the user, which was this template, which then it put any child route content in its outlet.
Got it.
So this is where it forces you to really depend on routes rather than you having to say, go grab this content and stick it over here in this div. Like the easiest way is create a new route and URLs, and then they get injected in the right outlets. And then this way it preserves, state. So when you start sharing links, it all looks the same. It's a better user experience. And
But what would you do if you had like like a module that's like a chat, say a chat box in the bottom right, and that's persistent. So it's not dependent on being like a nested route.
Yeah, yeah. So then a good case for that would be
I guess you use like an ng include or something.
So remember, everything gets injected into the application template. So like your application template is where things, when you render your entire app, your application template, you notice that Welcome to Ember has stayed on every single page. And everything is getting injected here. So you might have something here for like my chat. And as you start navigating between pages, I don't really have a whole lot of links here, but it would stay across the entire page. So that'd probably be I think the best place to put it. But Ember actually does have something like Angular.
You want that to be dynamic, like it's not, it's not something that's in the root template.
Mhm.
the root
Like
layout.
it's dynamic based on the URL.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, that's when
This would have to be right.
I guess you could do things on a per template basis maybe, or you might actually have to put it inside the application template like what we're doing here, but then use a service to have special data. So you change the service which updates the template. It's kind of like an Angular 2 where you might have something in the main template and then you update a service which then updates this other thing. But yeah, you might. Yeah, those are I guess a little not the defaults. All right, so this is like our basic app. So one of my favorite things. So I'm really into testing. Like I just mostly because I've written a lot of JavaScript projects, and some have been pretty bad, and I'm like, oh man, how did I do this? And I just hate stuff like that. And I like when things just work, and especially as an app grows, it makes it it's tough when you have to manually test things. It's not fast, and it just usually ends up bad. So Ember actually has tests built into it, and if you just navigate to /tests, you can actually see a list of tests. And because I've commented some things out, that's why you see some failing and some passing. But one of the cool things is that it's already set up. Every time we generate a new file, it created a test for us, and by default the test is passing, and you just have to fill in the test. And also a great thing is that it has JS hint already built into it. So if you're not familiar with JS hint, basically it's a linting tool that checks the syntax so that if you forget a semicolon, it's going to tell you. So it has that already built in. So if you maybe forget a semicolon, one of your tests are going to fail, and it's going to tell you, hey, watch out. You might be releasing a potential bug. So you can catch all this in tests. So let's go ahead and look at two kinds of tests. So there's a few different tests that you can write. You may have heard of them, unit tests, and then Angular they call them end-to-end tests. In Ember, they're called acceptance tests. So unit tests basically are like testing a single function. So if I give this function some input, do I get the expected output? And then an acceptance test, or an end-to-end test, as some people call it, is basically more black box. You treat it at a high level, and it's, if I visit this URL, do I see 5 posts on the page? So it's more of checking it from very high level and just, does my app work? So they're both useful, and you oftentimes write both. For really detailed things, you would write a unit test, but if you want to check to see like, is the page rendering with 5 comments here and a profile picture here, that's probably more of an acceptance test. And Ember has both built in, and they execute incredibly fast. So Ember's is a little bit different than some of the other tools, like if you've worked with Selenium, where it like pops open a browser and they're kind of slow and brittle. I've been in that situation, and usually I just don't end up writing them because they end up I just ignoring them because they take so long and they're just too brittle. Embers are just really fast, so it's like they're almost as fast as unit tests. So you can treat it, and they all run in the same test harness. So let's go ahead and look at that. So here's that test directory, and we'll look at a unit test first for the format date. So I've already kind of written this out. It was just checking to make sure, like, here's some static input, of something that I might get from GitHub, and I want to check to make sure that this same helper returns me something formatted. So if we actually looked at the corresponding implementation, which we kind of did earlier, that's really all it did, but that's kind of a good example of a unit test of writing for a specific helper.
So you have to kind of copy your functions to the test and do whatever.
Yeah, so you can just do it all in here, and
Okay.
like by default, it generated something that looked almost like this. It was just the only difference was I just added, I changed the text right here, and I added this this specific string and this. But other than that, it was like it's already set up.
So it doesn't copy the functions.
No.
You
It
have to actually copy them to the test form.
So the function gets incorporated into the test through these import statements. So it kind of brings in the format date function from the helpers file. So it like pulls this function into this test, and it's using ES6 modules. to do it. So yeah, they're pretty big on ES6. Like, you basically have to learn it when you're working with it because there's a lot of like import statements and all that. But it's kind of like require.js or browserify. But it's that's how they bring it into the test itself.
Right, you exported it, right?
Yeah.
The other file.
Yeah. So here is like a export default. So it's exporting this, which is a function. Or let's see, format date. So so ES6 modules, you can like export multiple things from a single file. Like you can export this function, or I can specify a default export. And in this case, I'm pulling off format date, which is right here. Yeah, the syntax is a little bit different because there's like a few concepts going on here. But you didn't actually have to write any of this. Like this was actually auto-generated by itself.
It's similar to like Node.js, like when you
Kind of like those require statements in Node. Yeah, it's kind of like that. Just just read up on if you're interested, like ES6 modules, and then you'll start seeing this and some of the newer things. But that's kind of one of the cool things about Ember is I probably would have never learned. I probably wouldn't have started learning some of the newer ES6 stuff if it wasn't for Ember, because I would have had to set up a transpiler and all that stuff. And people at work probably, I'm not going to set that. Well, I could set it up, maybe I wouldn't, but there might be a little bit more resistance, or for whatever reason, like it just comes with Ember, and it's like you just get to learn it here.
Could you go back to the other file for a second?
This one?
Yeah. This might be a newbie question, but what does let do? Why did
That's like another version of var. So there's like slight differences in it, but it's like another way of declaring variables. It's like, I think the phrase people were saying was like, let is the new var. So it's like another replacement for var.
It just means it's a locally scoped variable only, and it also means you can use it in if blocks, and it keeps it locally scoped.
Well, doesn't it do it one way or another, whether you use it or not?
There's some intricacy. Yeah, it's like have you ever heard of hoisting? With JavaScript has some weird parts like this hoisting stuff. Like you can spend like all day talking about it. But it's let alleviates a few of the problems from var that it had. Yeah. So, but if in this particular case, you could have just written it with var and that would have worked.
Or nothing at all?
You wouldn't want to do that.
You want it to have some scope, so you don't want to like just
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
throw out like a
JS doesn't let you not declare one.
I think it might actually see, that would be another thing. If I left it off, I think it might actually bark at me because it says, let's see, date is not defined because it against the JS hint stuff. So that's like a unit test. So now the opposite is kind of the end-to-end test, which is or acceptance test that Ember calls it, which treat it like a person manually clicking on your URL, like typing it in, visiting a page, and they can verify certain things are rendered. So to actually generate that, you would say Ember generate acceptance test, and it would be something like if I want to test the user / repos route. Now, in this one, you don't really have to have as much hierarchy for your acceptance tests. I just tend to put it as the same as the route names, but you don't have to. I'm going to say no, because I've already created this. And there's another folder called acceptance, and here's this repos test. And let me just kind of minimize a little bit of this. So it kind of generates all this stuff for you, and this is what you get by default. So it says some setup. Also, I forgot to mention, the testing is actually built on another framework called QUnit, which was used the testing framework for jQuery. Ember enhances a little bit, so it's like it's called Ember QUnit, so it's like the same, a little similar, but a little bit different to make it work with Ember a little bit better.
So you can't kind of port in like Mocha or anything.
There is actually another add-on for if you want to use Mocha, but most people, just because it by the default is QUnit, they just use QUnit. But yeah, you can use Mocha. So you got some nice functions like visit. So I want to visit this URL, and once everything has resolved, like Ember internally knows when certain things have happened and when they've resolved. So I can write assertion. So I can say, what's the current URL? SkaterDave 85/repo. So in this case, I might do something like I want to visit skaterdave85/repos and just assert that the URL is that. It's maybe not the most valuable, but you could also do something like assert.equal. What did I do before? I can find. So I think when you browse to the list of repos site, I want to check to see each repo actually had a class of repo. And if you looked at the repos template, I gave each its own div with a class of repo. So I can find all the repos and check the length and assert maybe I have 2, or, whatever. So I can save it. And you can see this actually running. Now, in your acceptance test, you probably don't want to actually hit GitHub's API, right? So one of the reasons for that would be it would make your test maybe a little bit. It's dependent on external things. So if GitHub's it has rate limiting and you hit it too many times because you ran your test too many times, then your test would fail or it'd make your test a little bit slower. So the way people have solved this in the past was they kind of they create like a fake server to say like when you hit this URL, don't actually make the real request. Let's respond with something that looks just like it, but it's like a static version of it. So outside of the Ember world, there's libraries like in Angular, it's HTTP backend, or if you're not using Angular, there's sign-on.js. In Ember, they have something called Pretender, and I basically set up some fake URLs so that when I say hit this, URL, respond back with JSON, and in this case, I left off a lot of the unnecessary data that you don't really need, but I've just set up some basic stuff. And through Pretender, the way it works is it kind of overrides the native Ajax object inside the browser, so it allows it to intercept requests to these URLs. And then Pretender, we have to kind of shut it down, so this kind of restores the native Ajax between tests. And then, so there's probably some reason why it's failing. I could actually check out the other branch and it's working, but this is kind of an example of what an acceptance test would look like. So you can actually write these and they execute. I mean, you refresh this page and it's executing pretty quickly.
So that's just running every single test you got.
Yeah. It looks like I have a few JS hints, so it's like small things that you can fix, but. All right, so the one thing I didn't talk about in the demo was Ember Data. So Ember Data, it's like another complexity to it, but it's a library for managing models in an Ember app. So in the demo, I just use plain jQuery Ajax calls. It's simple and it's great for getting started. But as your app scales, you probably want to have things like actual models for your app, models that can have their own methods and models that have relationships to other models, like a post. Has many comments, so there's kind of a relationship between each comment and each post. You want to have these relationships set up, and that's what Ember Data is. I mean, there's a lot of other features, but if you've worked in back-end frameworks, they typically call them ORMs, which is like these libraries that are allowed for working with databases. It's like a client-side ORM specific to Ember, and they call it an object relational mapper. So it's like you have objects in your JavaScript, but it mapped to records in your database, so like a relational database. Okay, so there's I'd say there's like 3 features of Ember Data that are probably my favorite. The first is adapters. Adapters and serializers. So you can think of an adapter. So there's this thing called the adapter pattern, and think of an adapter just like a wall adapter. So on your wall, if you have like a 3-prong outlet, like an outlet, and then, say you have like a 2-pronged like outlet, and you have a 3-pronged plug, and you can't really plug it in, right? So you have to use some type of adapter in the middle to kind of convert the energy between the two. Ember has this concept, or Ember Data has this concept built into it, and kind of the analogy is, you could have there's so many backends and so many endpoints. Like everyone has their own take on REST, and like RESTful APIs and the URLs and the payloads, and it's always different. So, but then you have Ember data. So Ember data kind of sits here. You have adapters and serializers in the middle, and then you can have any backend. So Ember ships with a few default adapters that just kind of make it work. So if your API follows certain conventions, then it'll just work, and you don't ever have to customize it. And you don't really need an adapter. But if you have to, if your API is like wildly different, so maybe some other team is making it, and you need to make customizations, then you can actually extend these adapters and make it work with any backend. So adapters and serializers, that's kind of what Ember data has built into it, so that you can work with any custom API. That's kind of the first piece. The next is, so if you ever worked in other JavaScript frameworks, you may have experienced like identity crisis, and it would be something like, imagine you have, you fetched a post or a comment, and you start making updates to it, and then maybe you make another API call to get that somehow gets that same exact post, and so you have two copies of the same post in your application. So you make updates to one, and this other one is an update. So you have like basically two copies of the same post, and in the Angular world, if you were to try and like handle this situation, you have to somehow say, okay, when this thing changes, go update this other thing, and that could just tend to lead into like a lot of unnecessary code. And so what Ember does is they have something called identity mapping. So if you have post with an ID of 5 and post and another copy of the post ID 5, these are basically the same thing. So they ensure that you only have a reference to one post with an ID of 5 instead of 2 or 3 posts with an ID of 5. So this makes it so that your UI stays in sync with your data. So you don't like update one and this thing over here doesn't update. It's just always in sync. So they call this identity mapping, just to make sure every object from Ember data has this identity, and you don't end up with an identity crisis like the cat.
So if you type in real time in one, will it update in real time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And it also has relationships. So I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you can have a post and it has many comments. You can specify these relationships so that from a post, maybe a post gives you, a list of IDs for a bunch of comments. Like you can actually relate these two models and traverse it and get access to them. So between like parent-child relationships. So this kind of, there's different types of relationships, if you work with databases at all, but there's like has many, like a post has many comments, or a comment belongs to a post. There's relationships like that. So I'd say like these three, where you have adapters and serializers, identity mapping, and relationships between models. These are probably some of my, my favorite features and some of the most commonly used ones. All right, let's see. So here's kind of an overview of Ember data. So you start off with something called the data store, and this basically is like this house full of all your records or your models. It asks the adapter to say, okay, how do I get the data? So do I get the data from local storage, or should I get it from an API, an AJAX call to an API? Where do I get the data from? So that's what the adapter is responsible for kind of translating how do I get that data. Then there's the serializer, which deals with how is that data formatted when it's transferred between your API and your client side. And then your actual persistence layer, like your database or local storage. By the way, this is probably one of the, we're understanding Ember data itself is like its own framework, and this is, I think, one of the reasons people get a little frustrated with it, because, it is complicated. Like Angular just has Angular. It doesn't have Ember data. And so, yeah, if this stuff kind of sounds confusing, like you start to appreciate the more you use it, but there is a little bit of a learning curve. But as a side note, I think if you are following the Angular stuff, Angular 2 actually, I think they're coming out with their own version of Angular data. So they saw some of this great stuff in Ember and kind of started writing it.
How does this relate to the Ember ORM?
So this is the Ember ORM, Ember data. Ember data is like the Ember ORM. They don't call it the Ember ORM, but it's like an ORM if you've worked with an ORM. But otherwise, people just say, oh, Ember data.
Yeah, ORM is like very back end. So I don't know if some of you are like front end developers, but like if you don't deal with a lot of back end,
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those acronyms you may hear. But if you don't, don't worry about it. It's just like another acronym.
So can you go over this one more time?
Yeah. So your store, they call it the Ember Data Store, and it houses all your records. And this is your backend. This would be, or your backend could be like a Firebase database, or your API, or like local storage, even in your browser. And all this stuff in between, basically is like provides an does all the customizations and stuff, so that this backend can get the data into your data store correctly.
So the communication is bidirectional?
So like say you were fetching a list of posts. Your posts, you would ask the store, say, hey, give me all these posts. The store would say, okay, I'm going to use my adapter to go talk to the persistence layer. And before I make the call, I might need to send some data along with the request. But that data might need to be formatted, so run it through the serializer. Once it goes to the serializer, then your API responds, and then the response of the API will also go through a serializer, because maybe you need to massage the JSON response. A really popular one is like, you've seen APIs where the response gives you like a data key, and that data key has a bunch of JSON inside of it. That would be a good place to say, okay, let's extract that data key from the response, and then so it can continue back to the store, because you might not need that. So I know that's a really common scenario, at least in the Angular world. The Angular world solved it, I think, with was it like interceptors?
So what's the difference between the functionality of the adapter versus the serializer?
Yeah. So the adapter is responsible for how do I get my data. The serializer is responsible for formatting the data. So formatting data that goes out and that comes in. So you might need to like massage it and tweak it a little.
Is Ember data is it optional? Because so in Angular you might create a service and you'd make that call, and then now great, I've got like the data I need and I can make more calls to it as I need to.
Mm-hmm.
Could you not? You said that Ember
Yeah.
has services. You could set it up.
Yeah, you could do it all in services if you want to. This Ember data is completely optional. I mean, even in the demo, I just used plain jQuery. You don't have to use Ember data. You start to realize some of the benefits later on as you run into certain problems.
Is the store like persistent? Is that one of them? Like you've always got sort of access to this.
You always got access to your store inside your routes and controllers and some other things. So where I said $.ajax in my route, I could have said this.store.findAll. But yeah, that requires, sometimes you have to tweak these things, and especially with GitHub's API, you might have to change things a little bit. So.
You only deal with ORMs like if you're really doing like heavy end backend, like you're tracking like people's every movements and you're trying to have lots of different relationships. First of all, you got to create a person, and like all these different things. But for most simple APIs, you probably might just be using JSON requests.
Yeah, that's why they say Ember is for ambitious web applications. It's more for they made it for the complicated scenario that scales down well for the simple one. But so you don't have to use things like Ember data, but it handles really well for the complicated scenario. Whereas maybe in Angular, it doesn't scale as well.
How about the model? The model that you created, where does that fit in?
Yeah, so that's actually next.
But does Angular Firefall, does it come anywhere in the picture at all?
Which one?
Angular Fire?
Oh, Angular Fire. So I think that's their implementation, to make it work with Firebase. Ember has one called Ember Fire, I think. So they have the same thing. But that's actually a good example. Let's see. For using another adapter. So actually, Firebase created an adapter called Ember Fire or something, so that it could talk to a WebSocket backend as opposed to an HTTP-based one. So they kind of added in. So if you wanted to write an Ember app and not create a backend, it's really easy. You can just install this new adapter, and it just works, and you don't have to do any configuration. Maybe one line or something, but it's super easy to use. All right, so to create models, there's just another class, and it's I just basically define some attributes and their types, and possible some relationships. So like a cat belongs to a home, and that cat can have many kittens. And so these correspond to other models. So home would be another model, and kitten would be another model. This is an example of using the store. So when you say like store.findAll, it's going to make a GET request to /cats. There's find record to get a particular cat. If you want to create a particular cat, it makes a post request. On the model, it has a method called save. So if you want to save it at any time, you can also destroy it.
What happens in the bottom too?
Yeah, I didn't have that much room, but these all return promises, and this would basically make a delete request to delete a specific cat. So the cat/ID would correspond to the ID on the model. And then same thing with this one, model save. It can do a post or a put, depending on like if your model is fresh, like it never was saved, then it would do a post request. But if it's already been saved, then it would do a put request. But it follows kind of the standard REST semantics. All right, so I'm just gonna. This is something I wish somebody would have told me when I first started getting started with Ember Data. It supports a few different serializers. There's 3 of them by default. So if your API looks something like this, where it just returns like, say you have a list of users, and your API returns just a standard array of user objects, you would use the JSON serializer. Some APIs do something like this, where you have like a root key, and it says like users, and you have the data nested under that. This is when you use the REST serializer. If you're using Rails as a backend, I haven't used Rails, but I think they have something in there where they set up JSON responses to kind of look like this. So, so then it just kind of works if your API looks like that. Now, there's another one called JSON API. So how many of you have actually heard of JSON API? So there's an actual specification called JSON API, which is confusing because you talk about APIs that are JSON APIs, but there's an actual API called JSON API, and it has a very strict format, and it kind of looks like this. I've left off a lot of stuff just to fit on the screen, but the JSON API spec, it's like a specification for standardizing JSON APIs, and one of the people behind it is the creator of Ember, and they have a serializer for it called JSON API serializer. So there's 2. I mean, these are all dealing with JSON, but one's targeted towards the JSON API spec. So if you actually just Google JSON API spec, it'll probably be the first link.
Is that like how that JSON comes out mapped to like a specific endpoint?
So the serializers, remember, are for just dealing with the data, whereas the adapters are dealing with the URL semantics, like the verb and the URL, the path. So,
well, I just mean, so in that example, the JSON API serializer had it kind of had relationships built in, it had includes.
Yeah.
Like, so if I went to cats1, typically I wouldn't get, all the included data, like all the cats, kittens, and that sort of thing.
Behind the scenes, your API would respond with all of this stuff, but then the serializer would change it so that your models get populated with the correct data. Like, every cat or user would get, this stuff, and then you have corresponding pets that get, injected into the store. But you do have to follow like this specific format for JSON API for this thing to work. So usually, if someone says like, okay, my API is following JSON API, then they're probably going to adhere to the spec, and then you won't have to touch the serializers at all. Like, it'll just work. But I think the more common scenario, like for my stuff, most of the APIs I've worked with look like this, sometimes like this. So a lot of times you can just use this on the JSON serializer, and maybe occasionally make a tweak or 2, but just something to be aware of if you do kind of start venturing into the Ember data path. All right, so almost done. All right, so here's like a few resources just to continue learning about Ember. This is literally this is longer than I thought. And then you can spend several hours trying to teach it. But the Ember guides are really useful. There's a couple paid books, like one called Rock and Roll with Ember. It's an ebook. It's like $30, but great read. Ember 101. That one's free. There's a discussion forum. I'll post these slides too if you guys want them. there's a paperback book called Delivering Audacious Web Apps with Ember. I wrote an article on testing with Ember on CodeMentor. And then if you want to, I'd say one of the biggest pain points for working with Ember is Ember data, especially for newcomers, because you see all the examples using Ember data, and then you might have some crazy API, or maybe you wrote the API or somebody else wrote it, and you want to work with Ember data with this API, but you can't get it to work. That's like the most frustrating thing, and so that's, I think, part of the reason why some people maybe give up on Ember and they think it's too hard is because like they're trying to use Ember and Ember data and Ember CLI with the custom API. There's like a lot going on here. So I wrote a post that basically explains serializers and how to make it work with custom APIs, because it's not an easy thing. I mean, it's not easy if it's your first getting into Ember, but once you kind of do it a little bit, then it starts making sense. So I would say like if you start playing around with it and that is one of your pain points, like try just doing plain jQuery Ajax until you actually need Ember data, and then spend some time studying up on Ember data and understanding the defaults first, and then make it work with a custom API, and then you'll kind of grow to appreciate it, and you won't like hate it from the beginning. So basically, don't give up and focus on the reason to continue. So one of the main reasons, like I found Ember to be a little bit on the tougher side to learn, but the main reason that kept me going was convention over configuration. I like it when they came up with a path to do things. I don't like it when there's like 3 different ways to do something. For example, like people in the Angular world start saying like you start off with scope, and everyone now is saying don't use $scope, that's bad. There's stuff like that. It's like there's one way to do it, and there's a lot of conventions built in, and it scales well for large teams. Everyone writes code that looks the same. It ends up in a well-architected application. Testing is built in. There's like, and the stability without stagnation, so they really keep the framework stable without without being forced to do complete rewrites on the framework. So if you believe in the philosophies of it, continue with it and just spend time learning it, and you'll grow to appreciate it. It is one of the more complex ones, but there's reasons for it, and you start to understand those reasons as you start making bigger and bigger apps. Yeah, so that's it.
All right, let's give him a hand.
Yeah.